Hi everyone, and welcome to another BAPT webinar. I'm Richard Owen. I'm a trustee of the BAPT, that's the British Association for Psychological Type. This is part of our In Conversation webinar series. Today we've got a guest from the US. He's joining us from Kansas City in Missouri, and he's an assistant professor of psychological science in the University of Central Missouri. He's also a counselor, and he's also specializes in counseling men and men's issues. And he's written some articles about psychological type that caught my attention, so I thought I'd invite him along for a chat. So I'd like to welcome Aqualus Gordon, or Quay as he likes to be known. Hello.
How you doing? Great to be here, man.
Yeah, great to have you. And it was almost a bit last minute because the time change confused us a bit, didn't it?
Yeah. I was out doing my civic duty, so.
Well, thank you. Yes, it is election day. Let's see how that turns out.
I'll see.
Things going on in the world at the minute, and we've got lockdown coming this week again on Thursday.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
We need one.
Yeah, another one. Yeah, strange time. So I'm just trying to get a bit of background on you first. Like, obviously, you're an assistant professor, and so what sort of work do you do? Is it a lot of research or lecturing, or a bit of both?
Yeah, a bit of both. I will say, and no fault to you, I did just get associate professor, got tenure this past spring, so a little update to the resume. But yeah, the school I work at is more of a teaching college. They do research. It's not entirely a teaching college, so we are still expected to do, quite a bit of research, especially in my department. But I do spend a lot of time teaching. I do spend a lot of time working with students directly, both graduate students and undergraduate students. And I primarily teach general psychology to freshmen, and then our upperclassmen, I teach abnormal psychology and sports psychology as well. And to our graduate students, I tend to help them with their thesis, so thesis prep, and then psychopathology, which is an advanced kind of abnormal psychology.
Well, that's a very broad base of knowledge that you teach then.
Yeah, and for the undergraduate degree, of course, and even for our graduate degree, it isn't very specialized, and so it is really about kind of getting students prepared for a doctoral program or another job that just uses psychological skills kind of broadly.
Mm-hmm. Is there an element of personality psychology in what you're teaching as well?
I mean, if you talk to my students, I'm always talking about it, but I don't teach the personality class. We do have a couple graduate and undergraduate personality classes. A more senior professor than me has those classes in his repertoire right now. So I'm waiting for that opportunity, but I do talk about it a lot, especially when we're talking about general psychology. I use it a lot when I'm talking to my students about sports psychology. It's really helpful to think about how different types are motivated, how different types are, just activated to the type of passion and intensity you might need in certain sports. So I use it in any chance I get, really, even though I don't teach that class directly.
So that's interesting. In application in sports, how does that work? Does this typology help people in sports in some way?
I think it can. I mean, this isn't something I've seen used broadly. We do, of course, see, especially the Myers-Briggs and then sort of derivatives of that, as well as other type theories being used in business a lot, which is using it for the same reasons I think it can be useful in sport, which is to say, thinking about, how people are motivated to work, think about, what types of things are maybe draining on folks, that might be in a sports team, might be in a competitive environment. And so it's not something I've seen used a whole lot, but I do think there's a pretty big avenue there. And certainly when I'm working with athletes, I do think about, I usually will ask them or have them take something to figure out what their type is, and then use that to think about how they're you know, working in the sporting world.
Would you suggest there might, I'm just thinking there might be a sort of an excess of people with extroverted sensing or dominant or auxiliary function in the sporting world, especially the elite sporting world? Do you think that's what you see?
I don't know. I mean, when you sort of have conversations, and this is mostly just online conversations to this level with folks, and you're talking about athletes, a lot of them tend to say that. I don't know. I think probably some sports, and I would think about sports that have a real kind of intensity about them, that have a real, I don't know, sort of physical aspect to them. But when you think about other sports, I play a lot of tennis. I play volleyball. If you think about things like golf, I think those are intuitive sports. You have to sort of see ahead a bit, even if it's kind of where you're going to hit the shot versus where your opponent is. For instance, in tennis, or, you know, I play, like I say, volleyball. Where's the block going to be if you're going to spike the ball? These types of things. So I think those are more intuitive aspects. So I think you see a blend of both. Of course, the sensors are going to have a more attention to detail, are going to be able to kind of lock in, especially SE, right? Extroverted sensing, really going to be able to kind of lock into that moment, that intense moment. So I'm thinking like of powerlifting, right? That seems very much like an extroverted sensing sport where you need to give everything you've got in this one intense moment. That doesn't take any kind of foresight or intuitive insight to kind of think about what's going on there.
Mm-hmm. We've got a lot of darts players in the UK. I'm not sure what that uses.
Probably closer to golf, right? I mean, it's probably, you know, how do I get this there given XYZ? But I don't know. I mean, that's a great study. That's something that, you know, because, you know, maybe jumping ahead a little bit, but because academics shy away from type theory, especially the Myers-Briggs, but type theory broadly, because that's what it gets associated with. We don't have a lot of studies on this. I'm sure there's a number of studies. I don't want to talk bad, but I'm sure there's a number of studies using, you know, the NeoPi, the 5-factor model, and these types of things in sports, for instance. I find the Big Five to be useful in some ways, but I also find it to be very, very limited. I find it to be, you know, almost too face valid in the sense of it means exactly what it means and not really anything else. I write in a paper a couple years ago that I had published that, you know, the Myers-Briggs, or I'll say first, the Big Five is like having a car and describing a trait of the car, which is to say the car is red. Whereas I think the type theory is like describing the dynamics of the car, which is to say the car has a V6 engine in it, right? And they both are describing the car, but one gives you some information about how that car performs, how much gas you need to put in that car, right? These other things that I think the other just tells you it's red, and it sort of tells you what it tells you and nothing more, right? The difference between how type theory thinks about extroversion, introversion, and how the Big Five thinks about extroversion, which is just to say you're a party goer, you like to talk to people, you know, whereas type theory is thinking about where your psychological state resides for most of the time. And that for me is a deeper level of psychology that I think is more useful. That's
great. So I see you're a counselor as well. I mean, obviously you're into sort of introspection, self-knowledge, you know, what's your journey been to get where you are now? You know, did you study counseling or psychology first, or how did it come about?
Sure. I mean, I always tell people I was lucky. I kind of knew what I wanted to do or had a broad idea from a pretty young age. And that was to be a doctor, to be a medical doctor, actually. And somewhere in high school, it's a bit of a funny story. Somewhere in high school, reality shows started coming on that were like, you know, real life in the ER or these type of things. And literally, I just figured out I couldn't stand the sight of the viscera that was associated with being a medical doctor. And so I had a little existential crisis at, I don't know, 14 and decided psychology is something that I could do that was still in this healing realm, still a doctor, and really I think utilized my skill sets better than I probably could have as a medical doctor. And so that was kind of the destination since high school, was to be a counselor, to be a clinician. And then when I got into graduate school, just kind of seeing what it meant to be a professor and these types of things, and then also getting the training of a clinician, I sort of last minute, I was telling somebody this the other day, made the decision to be an academic over a clinician first, or to at least apply for those type of jobs first. For a number of reasons, but primarily I sort of like the freedom that comes with being an academic. And it also leaves me the space to practice clinical psychology as I do now.
It said on your resume or summary that it was interests in the areas of human sexuality and working with men's issues. So what's that kind of work involved then?
Sure, that's my dissertation was on sexuality. I think my master's thesis was as well. And so for me, it's really about the psychology of human sexuality. My dissertation in particular was on thinking about how we identify and sort of categorize others with regard to sexuality, given that sexuality is on a spectrum, right? We can demonstrate this in research. We can demonstrate this anecdotally. But we still tend to think about sexuality as kind of a bipolar or kind of a tripolar, perhaps, construct, right? Gay or straight, or sometimes you'll see bi on the form, right? and so I was really interested, my research at least was really interested in thinking about both the underlying construction of sexuality in the individual, but the study itself was looking at how we label other people when we know information about their sexual orientation. So the research would ask questions like, John is a guy who has exclusively romantic relationships with women, but he has sexual relationships with men and women. And then it would ask you, either is John gay or is John straight, right? Kind of this forced choice and seeing where folks put there, but also leaving, is John straight? If you say no, he could be bi, or he could be gay, or pan, or whatever. And so we find that, of course, that folks tend to think of anybody who's had any sexual or especially romantic interaction with the same sex, they kind of force them all the way into this gay category. This is stronger, of course, for men. Men are more likely to kind of have that, you're either this or this. We allow women a little more space, it seems, to be flexible, if you want, in their sexuality.
Interesting stuff. Yeah, I live in Brighton, which is one of the most sexuality diverse places in the UK. I would say, where I live. And
yeah,
I get your point. There's all this kind of like LGBTQI something else. There's an ever expanding acronym of things. So
that's right.
It's a lot wider than we initially think.
I'm sorry, 1 second. I just lost your sound. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
All right, you're back.
So so let's go back to the MBTI. And I mean, when did you first come across experiencing MBTI and typology, and what did it teach you about yourself?
Sure. It was one of these things I'd heard about, I think in graduate school for sure. Probably undergrad, I can imagine taking a test or something at some point and kind of just getting those letters and not really thinking much about it. In graduate school, I started to just think about it, not really together with, but just beside kind of the clinical stuff that I was learning, and thinking about how it affects folks and how these people can be different. I didn't really start using it, but I was kind of just learning it for myself, and really just a little bit. When I go on to my internship, which is kind of the residency for psychologists, right? You're done with classes in school and you're just working full-time clinical work. I started studying Jung. I was just more interested in Jung. And so I got this essay from he's got this book called, something about the soul of a man. It's a small book that just has like a series of lectures, I think, and essays from him. So they're like pretty short. And one of them was on typology, and he's just kind of briefly giving this overlay of difference between thinkers and feelers, sensors and intuitives, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know why, but it was at that moment that it really kind of hit home for me, that it really became something that I started connecting to this broader concept, if you want, of psychology that I was learning and practicing. And so I started asking my supervisors, could I give this test to some of my clients and see how that fits for them, and see how we could maybe use it in the therapy process. And, they were amenable to that. And so that's when I kind of started using it and really studying it in this kind of deep academic and depth psychology way.
Mm. Did you go back to your original things more broadly then as well, and take it back to that?
Sorry, say again?
Did you then go back to sort of Carl Jung's original writings and sort of study back into?
Of course. Yeah. So, I mean, I have his book on personality type, or whatever it's called. I have that big book, and I've read it a few times. I make my students read it in my research lab. And so, yeah, I mean, I find it fascinating. I haven't gotten through the whole thing. The whole first piece of that book is fascinating to me, and I haven't read through it all, but it's in the kind of middle, the later half of that book that he's really breaking down the types. But for all of the naysayers about, type theory, the whole first half of this book is him doing this sort of detailed cultural, psychological analysis of how these types that he ends up with in the end of the book have shown up historically, show up in his kind of modern time, right? He's even talking about, in a low-key way, I think, he's sort of typing some of the other psychologists and saying, this is why they can't get this. They're this type of person. They think very rigidly. And so, he's doing all this work that, it's not quantitative research in the way that psychological research tends to be done today, for better or worse, by the way. But it is research, right? It is sort of an ethnographic, I don't know if that's the right word, but sort of research where he's sort of pulling things down from history and from culture that are pointing to these theories, such that he ends up with these through some empirical process, even though it's not, quantitative research.
Yeah, absolutely. There was, he speaks about, 20 years of clinical practice that went into behind the observations of people and understanding their inner states and inner dynamics of their minds through talking with them about it in a way that's like scarcely done these days. The sort of that depth of qualitative sort of research,
Yeah, I think we've sort of lost something in psychology, and this is probably where we are, is a necessary step to, psychology is always, not always, but for a very long time been very interested in joining the ranks of the hard sciences for whatever reason, right? They sort of are trying to step away from their brethren in sociology and anthropology who are comfortable with doing these types of qualitative studies, these sort of qualitative investigations. And I think, stepping away from that, we miss the sort of full dynamic of what psychology is. Have you guys talked to Dario Nardi? Have you ever had him?
Yes, I do know Dario, yes. Yeah, we've had him here, yeah.
Oh, I love that guy. I've only emailed with him, but my students read his stuff too. So one of the things that he said that really opened my eyes, I think it's written on his website, is that personality is very unlikely to be a linear or even a curvilinear construct, that it is chaotic, right? It is chaotic in the sense that there are all of these things acting on it, and the outcome, even if you know what it tends to do, can still surprise you. And that shouldn't be surprising, right? I tell my students it's like a hurricane model, right? I don't know if you guys, but over here we get a lot of hurricanes. So, you see the hurricane model, and when it's 100 miles off the coast, right? They've got like all of these different directions that it might go in. And it's not because we don't know how hurricanes operate, and it's not because we don't know the temperature of the water, right? It's because all of these things put together make something that is predictable to a point, but is really unpredictable. And personality's that way, right? There's all of these things acting on an individual, the environment, what's going on inside their head, their past experience, their feelings, right? Any social pressure, right? All of these things that, if you're a particular type, if you're a hard thinking type and you're put in a situation where, I don't know, you couldn't help but feel something, or you couldn't help but, do what everybody else just wanted you to do, that shouldn't be surprising. And we shouldn't go, aha, we've proven that type theory is unreliable. Well, no, humans are unreliable, right? And so we can't expect that just because we put them in this box that they're always going to behave in that way. And I don't know. So for me, Nari really opened my eyes to the idea of chaos theory, that idea of strange attractors, such that for now, I really think about personality in this different way that allows for anything, but still can give you a really good sense of who a person is and maybe what they tend to do.
Yeah, it's a nice way to put it. A lot of these tendencies and preferences they are constructs created by the human mind or statistics over time. But in reality, we only exist in the moment, in the state, right?
Right.
State is reality. Trait and types themselves are just constructs.
Of course, it's a lens, right? It's a lens.
Yeah. So let's go back to you sort of getting into typology and encompassing it in your work and your study. How does that go down with other academics that you work with or that you meet? And is there kind of strange glances in the corridor? Is there like
Oh yes. Yeah, I write in an article. I think I opened the article with this really happens. I love the guy. He's a really close friend of mine on the faculty, and we share a office suite, and so he'll regularly, if he hears me talking type to a student or talking about research, he'll regularly poke his head in my office and say, "Oh, you're on that horoscope research again, huh?" So, I do get this sort of derision in some ways from some of the faculty. I think it's playful, to be fair, but there is obviously this sense that, there's a little something funny about it, or, they find it at least humorous that I would engage in this type of research. So it hasn't been the type of thing where, and again, I'm not at like a Research One university, but it hasn't been the type of thing where it's like, how dare you be studying, this unvalidated or whatever they're saying these days measure. So it hasn't been that type of thing, but I do get glances if I bring it up, or in a faculty meeting or something like that, but it's fine. And then I just say, yeah, you're an INTJ. Of course you're going to say that.
It's cool. So, it's good that you've got this kind of banter going on, a bit of good-natured fun. Obviously it can get a bit more nasty out on the wilds of social media.
Of course.
How do you take it, when you see people, saying all kinds of pretty awful things about MBTI and typology and dismissing it out of hand? Do you just try and stay out of it, or do you ever get engaged in these kind of things, or how do you do it?
Oh no, I'm sort of on a mission, you know, like
Mm-hmm.
for me, it's, and like I said, I think it's back in that residency when I really started studying Jung and kind of putting the type theory together with a sort of broader theory of psychology, and at the same time working with people and seeing this in real time. And so for me, it stopped being this kind of theoretical thing that I had in my head that I only had any maybe even biased evidence that it fit for me. But I was seeing it fit for people. I was seeing that, you know, if I knew that this person was this type and I, you know, took a different approach because I knew they were more of a, I don't know, thinking versus a feeling type, that might require a subtly different approach, that those things work, right? And for me, it stopped being this thing that was theoretical that I felt the need to defend in a way that I was being defensive. It felt like the thing I'm defending because I know it to be true. I see it work. I see it work in me. I'm seeing it work in you right now, right? And these things that just actually show up. So for me, it's, you know, it's not absolute truth, and because it is just a concept, but it is truth in concept. And so you know, I love those discussions. I love taking people to task on, okay, well, why do you think that? And where's your proof? And they point to the, you know, the one article that everybody points to. And I point to my article where I, you know, I'm very critical of that article and say why that doesn't make sense and why those criticisms don't really hold up, especially if you're saying that there's some other test out there that does it better. You know, it's one thing I will say the hardest folks to get through to, and this is just fair, um, are the folks that just say, I don't believe in personality typing or traits at all. Like, I don't think you can, you know, do that to a person. That's okay, fine. But when folks say, hey, this test is invalid, but this one over here is, you know, amazing, and look at all the research that's been done with it. Well, I start to point to, you know, what that research says and what research that has been done with type theory or the Myers-Briggs has said, and which of them seems more applicable. And I also think, and academics aren't going to respect this, but I think anybody, you know, who's being honest would note that there is something to the fact that people identify with the Myers-Briggs types in particular, and to a lesser degree, just because it's less known, I think, to Jungian types, right? That folks see themselves in that and identify with that and recognize, you know, characteristics and behaviors that they share with whatever this descriptor is telling them. And so I think there's some validity in that, right? I mean, one of the things Jung says that I love, it's more about therapy, but he says, you know, don't be afraid to, I mean, do your work and do a good job, but don't be afraid of getting an interpretation wrong. Don't be afraid of interpreting wrong, right? He's talking about for a client and you're trying to say, okay, this is what I think is going on. Because if your interpretation's wrong, it will fall off. Even if they want to believe you, even if they go, oh yeah, I guess so, right? Give it a week, give it a few days, and they're going to say, actually, I'm not doing that. Actually, that isn't what's going on for me, right? They'll kind of figure out that that's not the right interpretation. And I think that's true for typology, right? That if these things didn't fit, and even if you kind of got really excited right after you took the test, you wouldn't keep coming back to it if it turned out that it really didn't fit for you. And again, I think there's some validity in the fact that folks recognize themselves in typology.
Yeah, I think you come, especially when you come down to like the functional level, you go back to
Oh
your
yeah.
8 functions or function attitudes. People
Mm-hmm.
can really sort of recognize when they're in those functions in the moment. I think that's a crucial thing for people, and they recognize what's really kind of taking them, like what's the main thing at the minute. Is it extroverted feeling, you know, are they caring for the social harmony and around them and the needs of people, you know, or whatever, you know, whichever function. So I think that's that experiential awareness. You're right, the validity is there if you're just able to observe your mind and what's arising in it and use it as a kind of map to help you understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite things to do is take that Jung book. So sometimes it doesn't work because some of his descriptions of the types are pretty complex, but some of them are, you know, he's always writing in a certain complexity, but some of them are just sing out to folks. If you're an extroverted intuitive and you read his description of extroverted intuitives, you know, you're gonna, you know, think he met you somewhere, because it just locks in, right? It just locks in with the sort of the pluses and the minuses, right? Being scatterbrained, being able to think of ideas, being relatively, you know, he says they're relatively jovial folks, right? But they also have this capacity to be, you know, in their own head, kind of working through things. So, you know, I love giving folks who are doubters just a real taste of, you know, this is what it says about you. Does that fit or not? You know, you can say you think the test is invalid based on the qualitative or quantitative results, but does this sound like you, right? And 8 times out of 10 will say they will go, yeah, that got me.
That's interesting. I think you told me before, is that your type as well? You're an extroverted intuitive?
Yeah, ENFP.
Okay, yeah.
How about you? I gotta ask.
INTJ, so.
Oh, okay. Hey.
I'm introverted intuitive, you know. And I'm married to an ENFP. My wife's an ENFP.
All right, good.
I'm very familiar with the ENFPs.
I'm afraid now. I'm afraid.
That's all right. No, I live in that world. It's great. Like, actually, I keep making friends who are ENFPs all the time now. It's great.
You know what? I keep making friends who are INTJs. I recently, like, randomly, I play tennis, like I said, and there's this tennis app, you know, where you can meet folks in the area to play tennis with. And I met this guy. We played tennis, and we just started chatting for a little bit, and kind of really hit it off. And so we actually went out for drinks after that. Of course, I'm going to bring up personality type, and sure enough, INTJ. So. I think it's funny how that works. I mean, that's another one of those anecdotal pieces, right? It's like, you know, look at your friends and then think about the ones that you really like. Look at your relationships, think about the ones that were working out, right? And does that have some pattern that is related to your type? It's not always going to be the case, of course, but I think some folks would go, yeah, I always tend to date this type, or everybody's been like this. So there's something there.
Yeah, there's often patterns. I agree. So back to this sort of, you know, these clashes with, let's look at people that are like doubters or anti-type people. I'm just curious about what you found works. You know, what sort of approach have you had success with in changing people's mind or opinions or attitudes towards type?
It depends on the person, right? I mean, sometimes, you know, it's just a matter of getting them to take a test and then saying, does this fit for you? Some folks will still be skeptical, like, yeah, horoscopes sound like they fit for me too. This is my neighbor. But I also point to research. I mean, research that I've done, and research that has been done on either the Myers-Briggs or just type theory in general. You know, some of the research I've done has been able to. I was really looking for ADHD relationships with certain types, extroverted intuitives, really. And it turns out like there was a strong association. It wasn't black and white. But it was this interesting combination that I thought was even more compelling. So, for instance, there are 2 types of ADHD. One is the one that you tend to see depicted, which is kind of bouncing all over the place, can't stop talking, very movement oriented. And then there's this other type that's really more of a scatterbrainedness, a more of a forgetfulness, a more of a, where did I put my keys? Oh my gosh, I'm going to be late. You know, okay, this person. And so I, you know, was interested in whether or not you could discern some of those traits, some of those symptoms, if you want, based on a person's type. And the research that I looked at, which had almost 2,000 respondents suggested yes. The folks that are the kind of forgetful types tend to be in extroverted intuitive types. Extroverted intuitive types in particular, who have a low introverted sensing, which kind of is that grounding function for the extroverted intuitive, and extroverted intuitives who had a low extroverted thinking function, right, which is kind of the organizing function for ENFPs at least. And so if you had this kind of combination of high NE and then low SI, low TE, well, then you were pretty likely to, map onto a lot of these ADHD traits. For the other type, the bouncing around type, guess what? Extroverted sensors, of course, right? They need sensory input. You ask them to sit still for a moment, they're going to lose their mind. They need to touch something fuzzy or, smell something nice or whatever it is. And so for me, I just find all of these other things that give it some evidence. So I point to those things. I just had a student do another study with me, and we were looking at intelligence as a function of the cognitive functions. We didn't find as strong of effects there, but we did find some stuff. It's weird to talk about because we got a negative result, right? We were thinking, and I don't know if you are involved in any of the kind of online discussions or even memes of Myers-Briggs communities around the net, but there is this trope, at least, that sensors are less intelligent than intuitives. Have you heard that?
I might have seen something about it, yeah, maybe.
Okay. So, that's what I'm saying. It's kind of weird to talk about, but just in terms of it being a valid kind of research tool, I will say something positive about sensors here in a minute, but we found that extroverted sensing in particular had a negative relationship with the intelligence scale that we were using. And so it wasn't this positive relationship of intuition with intelligence. There was a small relationship with intuition, extroverted intuition, I believe. But the largest effect by far was this negative effect with extroverted sensing. And so, again, a little bit of validity for the theory, and even a little bit of validity if perhaps biased, a little bit of validity on this idea that folks are having in the community of something that maybe they're just noting anecdotally. Now, we use a particular measure of intelligence that is a very short form, right? We were trying to get a lot of folks. If you give a real intelligence test that you're going to use for clinical purposes, you're going to sit down face to face with somebody for about 3 hours, showing them different cards, asking them different questions. That's what that looks like. And so we just gave what's called the Shipley short form, which is I think it's about 30 questions that just ask you to do some things. But the theory of intelligence is vast and complicated itself. And so I think if we were looking at things like, musical intelligence, certainly, as we were talking about before, maybe athletic intelligence, right? These other realms of intelligence that aren't just G, so to speak, that we would find that there are some positives, right? That there are some positive strengths to intelligence strengths to these other functions that maybe got kind of left behind in the study that we did.
No, you're totally right. You could say, Jung's 8 function attitudes or function, they're like 8 different ways to be intelligent.
I agree. I absolutely agree. And really the purpose of this study was to put a building block for that exact concept, because I do think each one of them is a type of intelligence, right? If you're good at it, if you're developed at it, right? If it's strong for you, it's certainly some type of intelligence. And so one of the things that I found, I've developed a function test myself. It is based on some of Nardi's work. I asked him if I could borrow the test that he uses. And so I adapted it a little bit for my own purposes, which is to look for just how the functions are ranked in the individual. My thought here was that, Myers and Briggs did us a great service in terms of kind of packaging Jung's theories into something that most people could understand. Okay, I take its test, I get these 4 letters, I go figure out what those 4 letters mean, right? But obviously, and even Catherine Myers kind of had this sense that type dynamics were really important to what's the dynamics going on underneath the type were really important to understanding the individual psychology. I actually was talking to Myers-Briggs Company a couple of weeks ago, and found out that Catherine herself really wanted type dynamics to be a bigger part of the Myers-Briggs, but there was a bit of a pushback after the company got formed and kind of who was in control of that. So, but when you look at those type dynamics, one of the things that I think is that most people maybe fit into, if you're an INTJ, right, NITE, most folks are going to fit that kind of lineup, and then the rest that follow. But I have a suspicion, I just had a suspicion that everybody can't, like there's got to be some uncommon, right, arrangements. There's got to be some folks who were arranged in a way that isn't kind of these typical 16. And so I've created a test to kind of look for those things. I don't really have necessarily a definitive answer on that. I know when I give it to folks and I'm looking at it just anecdotally one-on-one, I do see a lot of folks mixing around type of thing. But my idea there was that intelligent folks may score high on a number of these, because smart people tend to be weird, first of all, right? And so my thought was, I'm wondering, right, if maybe some folks who are smart, who are considered to be smart or intelligent, are actually kind of utilizing these functions either in a strange arrangement or are able to access them in a high level developed way, where other folks tend to have the one dominant and the secondary and blah, blah, blah. If really it's just this access to being able to think and process and act in these different ways.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about, it's that expression of what functions are actually being used or actually expressing. And,
right.
I guess I see that as different from the type. The type for me being like a sort of that developmental path by which you're really quite strongly drawn to like those dominant and auxiliary functions in your childhood, and then maybe the environment might force you to have to use different functions. And, the question is, how does that then come out in, does that affect your mental health in some way? If you're kind of fighting, going with the flow, you're sort of fighting your underlying disposition to some degree, or, you get the benefits of, like you're saying, weird and unusual combinations of functions, but what is the impact then on the sort of dynamic balance? Is there something kind of adaptive and balanced about the 16 types that kind of, like Myers-Briggs was saying, that it's beneficial to have at least good development of one introverted and one extroverted function, to have a connection to the kind of subjective and objective worlds. If you're all about introverted functions, maybe not so healthy for engaging with the objective world.
Right. I'm going to say something that she says, and I'm going to give you some things that aren't at all validated, but just theories I have. So I think she talks about that. I think it's Catherine Myers-Briggs. I don't remember. I forget. I mixed their names up. It may have been Jung. Thank you. It may have been Jung, but one of them was talking about this idea of, that you need these two balanced functions. And of course that cannot, whoever's saying that could not happen sometimes. They say it's more profound though for introverts, because if you're completely extroverted, right, you're going to be kind of missing some stuff and not dealing with some stuff and not processing some stuff, but people will still recognize you as an actor in the world who's doing things, right? If you're wholly introverted, right, that's going to look another way, in which people may find a bit, I don't know, jarring or at least remarkable. And so here's my theory. And one of the reasons, again, I was looking at ADHD was wondering if in some ways we could see, I don't know if we could see, like, if you have a high spike in a certain function, if that means you've got a certain disorder. That doesn't quite make sense to me, but it maybe makes sense to me that you would have a tendency for certain disorders if you were a certain type, right? That, I don't know, introverted feelers are more prone to depression, right? Type of thing, right? If you've got that and you're dealing with your feelings in here, sometimes they're gonna make you sad, right? Versus if mostly you're a thinking person, or your kind of feelings are outside of you. One thing I wonder, for instance, and this is really just a theory that I have no data for, but in particular for things like autism, um, that to me could be a sort of a profound introversion, right? That could be somebody whose function arrangements are TI, NI, FI, right? Because it's sort of, the word autist means sort of auto referencing, right? You're sort of referencing yourself. You're kind of in your own space. And so for me, that idea of not necessarily having high social functionality, kind of missing cues, being more connected in their own head, and perhaps being very connected to a particular thing, that these things might just be in reference to either a really high introversion, or maybe, if you want to put it this way, deficits in extroversion. We did do a little bit of testing on type. So when we did the ADHD test, we tested for symptoms. We didn't just say, do you have ADHD? We would say, do you do this? Do you do this? But alongside that, we did just do like a check box of, have you ever been diagnosed? Have you ever been diagnosed? And just listed every disorder I could think of. And so what we found was that folks with autism tended to have, the relationship that we could find in that little data was that they tended to have really high introverted thinking, and relatively low extroverted feeling. Those, of course, are on an axis, so that's interesting. But of course, that idea of having this really high introverted function, I wasn't able to see with this data kind of how their stack would look. But I was just able to see which were strong and which would be relatively weak. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said in there. Folks who, that same study, folks who tended to have or have had issues with addiction, extroverted sensors, right? And so just this interesting stuff that I think we could find if we were using this in a more clinical capacity. One of the things I say in that paper, to kind of give a little bit more shade to the big five, unfortunately, is that when you do this stuff with the big five, all you get is neuroticism every time. Depression, neuroticism. Anxiety, neuroticism. Schizophrenia, neuroticism. Right? Addiction, neuroticism. Right? But because it's again, it's just this sort of surface level thing, right? Neuroticism is like, something's wrong. Something's wrong inside. It gives us no real insight into what that could be, or where it came from. Are you always this way, or is this temporary, right? And so I think that with some work, we can answer at least some of those questions with a more dynamic test like Jung's functions.
Yeah. And of course, remembering that Jung was a psychiatrist and psychotherapist,
Right.
So, he was actively using his work with people with mental health difficulties. So he saw the extremes. And
he lays some of that out in his book, right? I mean, he doesn't kind of go right there, but when he's doing the type description, he tend to see him say, this is what this looks like when it's either not developed well or suppressed, right? Or when it's merged with another function, right? When it can't express itself, right? He talks about all of these different ways in which problems could show up for a particular function. And, he's not using the language that we use today of what's the categorical diagnosis, right? He's speaking about that. They did have some diagnoses back then, but really he's just kind of talking broadly about the issues that person would experience.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've got to probably wrap up soon, but I was just going to mention, in terms of 8 function spotting in a sort of pathological context, I once went to see a play. It's called, I think it's called The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime.
Okay.
It's a play about a boy who's autistic or has Asperger's. I'm not sure which one, but I think it's been to the States, and it's maybe on Broadway, and it's definitely in London. But it's a great one for spotting. It plays out scenes from this boy's life, of the challenges he faces and the way he behaves and reacts. And you can spot, it's like it's a beautiful thing for type nerds, like spot the 8 feelings. Someone's saying there's a book too, Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. Catherine's just posting that. So, you know, a great way to kind of study and watch out for those things as they're portrayed in a person's life.
That's really cool.
So yeah, I'll have to go and do some more reading of your work. It's fascinating, just what you're doing. It's great that you're, you know, putting forward the case for type. Look forward to seeing more stuff from you in the future. You know, it was your Psychology Today article that brought me to find you in the first place. So keep up the good work. It's great to see it. And, you know, we'll stay in contact, maybe have another one of these webinars another time.
All right. Hey, thanks, man. Thanks, Richard. It's been awesome chatting with you. And thanks for inviting me. I've had a good time. It's not often that I get to talk type in depth this way, so I love it.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's been really fun. And someone was saying as well, just to mention on the chat, they're saying mention it's for extroverted intuition. There's a book. One of our friends from the BAPT has written a book. She's using the name Gracie Pacey as her author title. And the book's called Time Bending.
Oh.
It's about people who are effectively perceiving preference types in MBTI. And it's especially extroverted intuition. And she's got a website called timebending.co.uk. I'm told to give it a mention.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's about J and P. So yeah, give that a shout. Everybody take care. We'll see you soon. Thank you, Craig. Take care, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, man.
Bye. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.